Hello and welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week?
As per usual, Gary, I am absolutely fantastic. Couldn't be better.
Wonderful. This week we're starting a new series of the podcast, courtesy of my client, friend, and fellow coach, Fiacre McSweeney. And Fiacre suggested that we do a podcast on substances. And the reason I say substances is because what he wanted us to discuss were things like the science of supplements, what supplements to take, maybe how different supplements work. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of the supplements that might fit in like the medical category later on in the series. And that's why I'm just kind of saying substances. So throughout this series of the podcast, what we'll do is we'll move from the general and the basic to some of the more specific and advanced topics. So in this episode, what we'll do is we'll discuss general health supplements. So this is an introduction to some of the supplements that, your grandmother might be taking, or your uncle at the dinner party might be asking about, should I take this supplement? We'll cover some of the basics on that today. And then in subsequent weeks, what we'll do is we'll get into more the nitty gritty on specific goals. For example, what supplements might actually improve your muscle growth, or what supplements might, help with your blood pressure and those types of things. But for today, general health supplements is where we're starting.
Yeah, and it's interesting that most people, they first of all, they think, oh, like the general health supplements or the general supplements, the stuff that the every average day person knows. I don't need to talk about them. I don't need to focus on them. It seems like the thing that gets rewarded on like social media and YouTube and whatever else is, let's talk about the most esoteric random supplement, which has like really poor evidence supporting it, isn't really, backed by much at all other than like marketing hype. That's the substance, that's the supplement, that's the drug, that's the whatever that we need to be talking about, not the stuff that generally works and has been well researched. And it's weird the way that that's the kind of way the industry has chosen to go, and also the way that people interact with media in general. It's like, oh, I need the secrets. And if you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, we're not about that life. We're not about here's the one weird trick that you need to do to, I don't know, fucking whatever the goal is. It's like that's generally not the stuff that works. And then also there is a bit of a hierarchy, we'll say, with all of this stuff, right? In terms of, you probably shouldn't really be looking at supplements or substances. Well, I should maybe not say substances because some people need them for like medical reasons. But you generally shouldn't be looking at supplements, at least unless you already have your general health stuff looked after. And what I mean by that is, like, we often talk about the 4 pillars, and there is a conditional 5th one, but it's not really the realm that we speak in. But there is, sleep. Are you sleeping enough? Is it high quality sleep? Are you doing all the things that you need to do to get good sleep? Like, you can take all the fucking drugs in the world and they probably don't compare to the effects that sleep has, because sleep is just so, it has its tentacles in everything, right? Stress management, that's another pillar, right? Are you doing any kind of stress management? No, you're not. Well, taking a supplement to lower your stress is not going to work. Taking a supplement to build muscle when you're super highly stressed, missing workouts, etc., again, not going to work. Right? So we need to have stress management in place. Then we also need to have training. So our exercise habits, like, again, you can take a muscle building supplement, but if you have the shittest workouts, your training program is really poorly designed, it's not effective, you're also not consistent with it, etc., the supplement's not going to do anything. It's just going to burn money, right? And then obviously nutrition. When we're talking about supplements, the thing that most people really should be focusing on first and foremost is their nutrition. And we're going to repeat that a variety of times throughout this podcast, both this episode and the series in general, because if you could get your diet in a really good place, you probably don't really need a huge amount extra in the terms of supplements, right? So we have to keep that priority or that hierarchy in mind in terms of, okay, We need to have our diet, our nutrition in general, our training, our sleep, our stress management practices. We want to get them dialed in. Now, supplements can definitely help with that. And I'm not saying that you have to be absolutely perfect with all four of those things, but we have to have the basic things. We have to have the basics. You have to have a sleep and wake time. You have to be able to go, okay, there's 8 hours of sleep. You have to be practicing some sort of stress management, even if it's just organizing your day, right? You have to have effective training programs or training plans. And then you also have to have some grasp and some hold on nutrition, some good, healthy food habits before you start spending your money on any of these other things, right? That's the priority list. Would you agree with that, Gary?
I would indeed agree with that. And personally, I'd say I'm very much a supplement minimalist in the sense that, like, yeah, of course, I've tried plenty of supplements over time, but I'm really not one of those people that's wake up every morning, opening up 10 supplement bottles and taking them and hoping for the best. Most of my nutrition comes via my diet. And even when it comes to taking something like a multivitamin, which is where we start, most of the time I'm not really taking a multivitamin. And not that I think it's like almost like a philosophical point more than anything else. I just don't feel I need the insurance. Maybe I do. But that's kind of my perspective. And that's something that's actually really important as an introduction to this conversation, is that when you start to think about whether or not you should take a supplement, there actually is like a general philosophy that goes into making that decision. And that some people might want to be health optimists in every domain, and they're willing to take or to accept more trade-offs, for example, in their finances. So if I say to them that X supplement might produce a very, very small benefit in some areas of health for some people, but we have no idea of knowing if you're that person and if you'll ever benefit, they'll say, yeah, absolutely, I'll take the supplement, no problem. If there's any chance of me benefiting, I'll take it.
And I'm definitely more on that.
Yeah.
I like to research things a bit more than just go like, oh, well,
yes, you're not just winging.
There's the 0.05% chance maybe it might work. I'm like, I'm probably not that far down the rabbit hole, but I definitely err on the side of, oh, this is going to give me a small improvement. Let's get those improvements where I can, or this potentially might lead to, I don't know, a lower incidence of heart disease in the future. Okay, cool. Like I've said it before, I'm like, my goal is to live to 120 at least, like your goal is to live to at least 80.
Yeah.
So I'm like, there is a difference in our overall philosophy in terms of how we interact with this stuff. And like you said, that's important to consider off the bat.
100%. And that's actually my point, is that I'm not saying there's a right or wrong here, because there's not. It's genuinely a question of like your personal philosophy in health and your personal philosophy in life. Not everyone has to want to maximize longevity and sacrifice many other things along the way in order to pursue that. It's totally okay to make different decisions. And that's actually, it might seem like a point that's kind of irrelevant or tangential, but it's actually the first consideration when it comes to making any supplement decision. Because a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today and in the series in general, we'll be saying things like, this might benefit you, we don't really have great evidence, but some people might be willing to say, okay, there's not great evidence, but I'm willing to make the leap and say, this might help. If I was a professional athlete and that was my entire focus was just on performing my absolute best, I'd be willing to make a lot more sacrifices in terms of investing money in supplements, investing time in different speculative recovery methods, etc., than I would be with my current life. Okay, so that again is a personal decision, and it's totally okay to not be like 100% evidence-based. You don't have to just wait until there's 10 randomized controlled trials in your specific population before you take a supplement. It's a personal decision at the end of the day. So that's where we start.
Yeah, and also the next point, and it's related to this, is that you have to look at all of these things as like a cost-benefit analysis, because you might think, oh, there's no harm in taking a multivitamin, because we're going to talk about multivitamins in a second, right? There's no harm in taking a multivitamin, right? But that's not actually the case. There is potentially harm in everything we do, every choice we make. There are potential cons to that. There is potential harm that you could get from that. It's not a like only positive or only potentially positive scenario. There are potential negatives here. for a variety of supplements, for a variety of things. Again, it depends on the specifics, but you have to look at every single intervention you do as having pros and cons, and this is especially important for coaches, because we often go down the rabbit hole of thinking like, oh, I'm just going to make a dietary change, and you only see the pros, the only positives of that dietary change. You're like, oh, I'm going to get this person to eat more protein. That's only going to have a positive effect on their life, their health, their performance, etc. But there are potential negatives to that intervention, and it could be just a cost thing. It could just be financial. All meat is a bit more expensive, but it could also be a health ramification. Like they might have an undiagnosed kidney disease, for example, and then all of a sudden you ramp up protein intake and that becomes more apparent, now obviously that's quite rare, but I'm just saying that like all of our interventions, whatever we do, it's not just a 0 to positive, this could be negative, it could be positive. It depends on the situation, right? So you have to accept that while there are potential positives, there's also potential negatives, especially in this day and age where, you can just go online and go, oh, I saw on TikTok that all the kids are taking X supplement, and then you just buy it from some fucking dodgy, Chinese website, get it shipped over. It took 6 weeks to get here. Like, you don't know what you're taking. You have absolutely no idea what you're taking in that case, and you see this all the time where like people taking like free workouts that they're like, oh, I got this. Like in Europe, people will be like, oh, I got this in like Eastern Europe, in the Balkans somewhere. And it's like, right, like what the fuck is in this? This is so unregulated. Like you don't even know, and it might be fine, might have no health ill effects, but you might also be the one that dies from taking that supplement. Like we just don't know, right? So that is important to understand. And again, it goes back to your personal philosophy. You might be like, oh yeah, I'm willing to take more supplements or do more things in the hope that there is a small advantage, but that has to be weighed against the fact that there's also potentially a negative with these things, and again, it could just be financial, and you might be okay, you'd be like, oh, that's fine, I don't care about that as much, right? But it could also have health ramifications,
Absolutely. And that's particularly the case for, if people are on other medications or they have certain health conditions. There can be interactions between supplements and drugs that can be consequential in some cases. So that's why when you read an article on supplements or you hear people talk about it on podcasts, they always give the disclaimer, don't make any changes before you speak to your doctor, etc.
Consult your doctor about this before you.
It is for a genuine reason. And of course, the cases where it's going to be very significant are few and far between, but of course, if it can be quite significant in some cases. So anyway, with all that said, all of our caveats out of the way, we will come back to some of those points, but let's start by talking a little bit about multivitamin supplementation. And I guess you could say multivitamin, multimineral, multi-nutrient. That tends to be the case with a lot of multivitamin supplements these days. As you look down through the ingredient profile, yeah, you'll see some vitamins, but then you'll see quite a lot of minerals. You'll see, increasingly more phytonutrients, bioactive compounds, and other things that are often in very small doses. And sometimes when people begin to approach these supplements, they see the big long lists and they're like, oh, this is amazing. There's so much of everything in here. One of the big problems with that is that the more you try to squeeze in, the less likely it is that there's going to be an adequate dose of any one particular ingredient. And that can sometimes be marketed in a deceptive manner. It might say this multivitamin has more minerals, more vitamins, and more nutrients than any other on the market. But it's kind of irrelevant if there's not an adequate dose of any of those, because you could just have 1% of the RDA of 100 different nutrients, and well, that's not really going to do anything for you, is it? So that's kind of the first point on multivitamins, is that you have to ask yourself, when you approach a multivitamin supplement, am I taking this supplement with the intent of maybe covering a couple of bases that are likely for me to be deficient or insufficient in, given my diet as a whole? Or am I taking this like huge shotgun approach where I just throw in all these nutrients and hope that something happens? Because they're actually two very different approaches. Because you might have a multivitamin that has, let's say, quite a lot of vitamin B12 and magnesium and iron. Let's just say those three. And those three happen to be closer to being insufficient in the over 65s, for example, or in the Irish population generally, then that's actually a reasonable approach to a multivitamin supplementation. Whereas if you're someone who already has a great diet and now you're spending €60 a month on this shotgun approach to a multivitamin, probably less likely to be of benefit there. So even though multivitamin is kind of one category of supplements, there are many different types within that and many different reasons why someone might approach multivitamin supplementation.
Yeah, and just related to that is the fact that you'll often see as well on multivitamin labels, they'll be like 1,000% of the RDA, you know, or like 200% of your RDA, you know, your recommended daily allowance. That's what RDA stands for, right? And again, it comes back to your philosophy of like, why are you taking this? What are you trying to do with this? Like, what is the actual goal with this supplement, right? And with a multivitamin, again, like you're saying, it can be effectively two things here. It can be a variety of things, but we'll just keep it dichotomous here. You can be like, I just want to have nutritional insurance. I just want to go, I think my diet is relatively good. You know, I follow the Triage boys. I'm eating my vegetables. I'm doing everything. I think I'm doing everything right. But you never know. There could be one or two nutrients in my diet that I'm a little bit lacking on, you know, like I just buy my food from, I don't know, let's say Tesco or whatever, right? You're like, I don't know what quality the food is. I think it's quite good, but you know, I'm like, I don't know what the quality of the food is. Could be nutrient poor. Who knows, right? I'm not testing the food. I don't have the expertise to do that. This, I don't know, broccoli that I get, it says generally 100 grams of broccoli has X amount of vitamin C, but I don't know if this one does. You know, I don't know if my specific diet actually has all the nutrients that I need, you know, and maybe there's a few nutrients in there that I don't know where to get them in the diet. Like, for example, selenium. You're like, where do I get that? You know, am I eating enough selenium? Right. So you're just going, I want to take a multivitamin to just give me a small amount of these different nutrients to make sure that I'm getting some of the nutrient. I'm not trying to get 100% of my RDA. My diet is already good, you know? So you would then select a multivitamin that just had a lower dose, you know? You might actually want to go for a multivitamin, multimineral, whatever, that has way more ingredients on it, but they're all in a lower dose, right? However, again, like I said, you could also be using a multivitamin for, oh, well, there's a few things that I know I actually really struggle with in the diet, or I know that the population that I fall into in general struggles with whatever it is. Then you might go for a higher dose, you know, multivitamin that has, you know, like maybe again, like a prenatal multivitamin. You're like, oh, you know, I'm intending to get pregnant or whatever, right? I'm like, these are the nutrients that we need to make sure we're getting enough of in the diet. This is the one that I'm going to go for, you know? So again, we have to be clear in what we're doing. But related to that is the fact that very often a lot of these multivitamins will just have stuff in it that's not actually helpful at all. You know, like you could go into there and go into that first approach. I'd be more inclined to that first approach. I'm like, I take a multivitamin. I take, you know, lower dose multivitamin that has more in it, because I'm like, I think my diet's generally quite good, but you never know, right? So that's what I choose. However, I could choose, using that approach, I could choose a multivitamin that now has a load of extra, like random, you know, we'll call them bioactives or plant compounds or whatever, that aren't really in high enough doses to do anything. So really all they're doing is adding to the cost of the product, but not actually giving me any benefit because they're in such low dose, right? So we have to be aware of that. And then also, and this is a much harder thing if you're just a more casual nutrition, health, fitness enthusiast, which is there's certain nutrients that we don't want to mega dose, or we don't want to have super high intakes of, but very often multivitamins do actually have quite high doses of those things. Again, I've said prenatal multivitamin there a second ago, so we might say, oh, well, pregnancy multivitamin with super high levels of vitamin A, for example, that wouldn't be ideal. It's teratogenic. So, you know, you could potentially get birth defects from that, right? So we wouldn't want to choose that. If you're a man, for example, you might go, oh, this is a good multivitamin. But then you see on the label, it's like, I don't know, 50% of your iron intake in this. And that potentially is harmful for you as a man, because you're not bleeding often. You're potentially at a higher risk for just accumulating excess amounts of iron. And maybe you already have a super high red meat intake as well. So it's not really of benefit for you, So we have to be very clear in terms of why we're doing this. We actually have to educate ourselves a little bit in terms of what we're looking for on the label, related back to our goals. Like, are we trying to, pick one or two nutrient deficiencies or insufficiencies and fix those? And then we also have to go, do I need to take a multivitamin, or should I just take those single nutrients themselves? Like if you're going, oh, well, actually it's vitamin D, which we'll talk about later on in the podcast. You might be like, oh, it's vitamin D that I'm insufficient in, that I know I'm insufficient in. Maybe I've got a blood test that shows that. Or maybe you're just like, look, I never go outside. I haven't seen the sun in 50 years, right? You're like, okay, so vitamin D is something that you want to focus on. Using a multivitamin to get your vitamin D intake probably isn't going to be the best way to go about that. So again, we have to look at it and go, are we trying to fix a single nutrient insufficiency, or just shore up the diet on a single or maybe 2 or 3 nutrients? Or are we trying to use some sort of like nutritional insurance by using a multivitamin,
And I think that's probably the general approach would be that insurance is probably the reason that most people would take a multivitamin. And I think that's pretty wise. But again, if you're going to go for those more targeted approaches, it might just be better to just go for the single ingredient itself that you've identified to be insufficient or deficient. So I don't have too much else to say really on the topic of multivitamins. I think that when it comes to whether or not you should take a multivitamin, I think it's a personal choice, in that it's probably more of an insurance policy. It's not the case that we have great evidence to support multivitamin use for like any particular outcome, and you kind of wouldn't expect that either, because it's like if you were trying to correct a deficiency, you just use the single nutrient and then you'd see that outcome. Whereas if you just apply multivitamin in general to the population, you're not going to see the same effects. So I think it's not like I would turn around and say everyone should take a multivitamin. I would say that if you want to apply general health insurance, it might be wise, particularly if you notice that you have lapses in your diet quality, or you're in a population that might benefit more from multivitamin supplementation. So like pregnancy, for example, you can get a specific pregnancy multivitamin, mainly concerned with folic acid, but with some other nutrients as well. Or maybe you're an elderly population, you have certain gastrointestinal disease that might put you at risk of certain deficiencies, or you might be on medications that lead to certain deficiencies. All those things can obviously be discussed with your doctor in specific cases, but for most people, it's just going to be a general insurance policy, I think.
Yeah, and look, again, like we could spend ages here going, well, this is higher quality, or this specific form of, should you get a tetramethylfolate or tetramethyl, I can't even fucking say the word, hydrofolate. Should you go for that? Or should you go for folic acid? Like there's so many things that you could potentially focus on within this. But again, it's probably not worth your time. It's probably not worth your time to spend 5 hours looking into this stuff when you could just eat a better diet, and then get one of the more generic multivitamins. I would generally still try to focus on getting multivitamins that are third-party tested. That would be our general recommendation with all health supplements. And I probably wouldn't, prioritize getting a multivitamin just that's like a store brand one. Like I'm sure they're fine, but they're probably not spending as much time on formulation and thinking about what the more optimal doses are, what the more optimal nutrients to have in this. Like your Tesco or your little store home brand one is probably not as heavily invested in terms of an intellectual perspective as, I don't know, a company that all they sell is a multivitamin, So again, we have to weigh that up. But again, there's pros and cons, cost, ease of access, et cetera, right? So Gary, that's the multivitamin. What else then, right? Well, actually, before we do that, general pop coming to us, they listen to us, listen to this podcast. Yay or nay on multivitamin?
If you have disposable income, you're very concerned about your health, and you think that there might be some lapses in your diet, and you want to cover all your bases, I'd give it a yay. If not, meh.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And again, this is also one of those things where you actually don't have to take a multivitamin every single day.
No.
You could just take it a couple of times per week and just go, cool. I know at least a few times per week, I'm getting a nice dose of nutrients, you know? Maybe you take it on the days where your diet quality is a little bit poor, whatever, right? Again, there's multiple ways that we can go about this. You don't have to take it every single day, right? After that, Gary, next supplement. What are we looking at?
The next one is a very popular one, and that would be omega-3 supplementation, most often used synonymously with fish oil supplementation, but not always. And omega-3s are long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, EPA and DHA being those that we're concerned with. And these supplements are purported to have many different benefits that people will talk about. Some of those most frequently discussed would be related to cardiovascular disease. And then also, cognitive health is another common area that people talk about omega-3s. You'll see all sorts of different claims about their potential benefits. And that's always going to be the case when you have specific nutrients that act in many different parts of the body. But the question is not, does a given nutrient have a potential effect in a given area of the body, but do we actually have evidence that supplementing with additional quantities is going to lead to better outcomes for that particular system, for example, the cardiovascular system. And in this case, we have, evidence that would be in favor of that, but there's sometimes back and forth results. Does it reduce cardiovascular disease? Doesn't it reduce cardiovascular disease or disease risk? Probably quite a bit of variance in terms of how much is actually used. Like, for example, there have been trials reducing cardiovascular risk in clinical applications of omega-3 supplementation, where it's pharmacy grade. There's very high potency, very high doses. And if you compare that then to the average omega-3 supplementation that you're going to get in, I don't know, Boots or Tesco, you're not going to see the same outcomes. So you will see mixed outcomes here, but in general, the reason people often supplement is to do with cardiovascular disease risk. One of the mechanisms that's of relevance is reduction in triglyceride levels. There are some other effects on the vasculature, reductions in blood pressure. And overall, I would say omega-3s in the diet, probably cardioprotective. But omega-3s in the diet and omega-3s supplemented aren't always exactly the same. And that then brings us to the question of who should supplement, how much do we need, etc. So where do we start with that, Pat?
Yeah, well, in general with this, like you said, there's back and forth. You can pretty much use the research to confirm, we'll say, whatever bias you have. You might go, oh, there's absolutely no benefit to omega-3s, or, oh, there's a benefit to omega-3s, but there's no benefit to supplemental omega-3s. And you can also go, oh, there is actually a dose-dependent benefit to omega-3s, supplemental, dietary, etc. Right? So to cover all your bases, right? If you're going to this going I don't know how to read research, I don't know what the fuck to do, I just want some practical take homes, right? It's probably a good idea to include fish in your diet. I don't think anyone, even the most ardent anti-omega-3 dieters, are going to say, oh, fish is actually bad, right? Most people are going to say, yeah, fish is probably a good thing to have in your diet, right? So you want to include fish in your diet. Ideally, we're probably going to focus on oily, cold water fish. That's probably going to be the best way for you to get your omega-3s, but I'd be pretty happy if you included fish in your diet in some form or other, right? Now, that's the general background. Ideally, some fish in the diet. How much? That is the question. Probably more than most people are willing to eat. That's the short answer, right? I personally really enjoy fish. I think I could be a pescatarian, right? I really enjoy fish. However, it's just a little bit less practical to cook fish every single day, right? It's like it's not as easy to cook as say like beef mince or a steak or chicken breast or whatever, right? So from a practical perspective, most people are not cooking fish every single day, eating fish every single day. And then we also have children like Gary who are like, oh, the taste of fish is it's not nice, right? I'm just being hyperbolic here, but a lot of people just don't like the taste of fish, right? So they're unwilling or unable, whatever, they don't have access, again, cost, etc. They don't have access to fish, right? They're not able to get that in the diet. In that case, we're probably going to suggest that person consume more supplemental omega-3s, right? Fish oil, that's the general one that we recommend. There are other ones, algal oils, if you are, a vegetarian or a predominantly plant-based dieter. So you can get omega-3 in supplemental form, right? If we're eating fish, the general recommendations are to eat fish twice per week, right? 2 to 3 times per week. That's generally what people say. Oh, if you eat oily fish 2 to 3 times per week, you'll be able to get enough omega-3s, right? And that is true. And this comes to the next point, which is how much omega-3s do we actually need? Do we need to just eat a sufficient amount to, cover the bare minimum? Because omega-3s, well, there are essential fatty acids, of which we can call them 2 branches here. There's some that are omega-6s. Arachidonic acid is the one that's often touted. There are other ones potentially that are essential. Now, that's really easy to get in the diet. So even though it's essential, we don't need to think about it, right? It just happens by accident. If you eat a normal human diet, you're going to get enough omega-6s, you're going to get enough arachidonic acid, right? However, the other one, omega-3s here, now it's often said to be, I always get these mixed up, is it ALA or, ALA, alpha linoleic acid, which is the omega-3 version of, was actually linoleic acid is the one, not arachidonic acid, but again, this is just pedantics. So you want to focus on the omega-3 branch. We can go to that ALA, EPA, DHA, of which the EPA and DHA seem to be the actual ones that we need rather than the ALA. But anyway, that's just going into unnecessary detail here. Either way, they are essential fatty acids, so we need to consume them in the diet. Our body can't make them, so you need to consume them. So eating fatty fish 2 to 3 times per week, that's probably going to cover your essential fatty acid needs for the week. This brings us to the next point, which is, are we just trying to cover our bases, cover the bare necessities, or are we trying to optimize things, right? Because there does seem to be a dose-dependent result from omega-3. I'm saying result because it seems to be a dose-dependent result for cardiovascular disease, for cognitive benefits, etc. So all the things that we say, oh, omega-3s are good for, it seems that higher doses seem to be better, right? Up to a point, obviously, right? Now, what are we trying to do with this? Are we trying to cover our bases? If you're just trying to cover your bases, eat fish 2 to 3 times per week. Happy days. Don't even think about it, right? You're done. No need to supplement. If you're not able to eat fish, then you're going to need to supplement to just cover your bases. If you are someone who eats fish but wants to really get an extra benefit, maybe you have, a higher risk of cardiovascular disease in your family, right? Or you've gone to your doctor, you've got bloods done, you're like, oh, my triglycerides are actually a little bit high. For you, we might supplement. We might start bringing in some sort of omega-3 supplement. Now, how much per day? That's going to be dependent on your background fish intake, right? But the research seems to suggest that somewhere in the range of 2 to 5 grams of EPA and DHA per day seems to be robustly associated with benefits, right? Now, you probably don't get that much if you're eating fish 2 to 3 times per week. Like 100 grams of fish, let's say 100 grams of salmon has roughly 1 gram of, 1.2 would say, 1.2 grams of omega-3s, right, in forms of EPA and DHA, right? So let's say, we want to get 5 grams of EPA and DHA per day. Are you eating like 400 grams of salmon per day? Probably not, right? Most people are not doing that, right? So you're probably going to need to supplement if you want to get to those higher ranges. Now, the thing about that is there's a variety of different supplements, different forms. Some of them are higher potency, some of them have higher concentrations, etc. Like you go to your, again, Tesco or whatever, you might get a fish oil capsule and you go, oh, I just have to take 5 of these. That's not actually the case. Most of those fish oil capsules will have maybe 400 milligrams of EPA, DHA, right, combined. So you actually have to take, let's just say 10 of those capsules to get an effective dose, get to those higher ranges of those doses. Like that's going to be 4 grams if you take 10 400 milligram capsules, right? Most people are also not willing to just chug back 10 fish oil capsules per day, add on 10 grams of fat to their diet, been doing that, and then get through the tub of fish oil capsules in like a week, right? So we have to, again, think about this a little bit deeper in terms of what's practical, what's actually realistic, what can we do as individuals. Like, again, when we were talking about earlier on about our philosophy, like I personally, I'm like, yeah, actually, I really notice a benefit from taking fish oil. So I'm going to try have a higher fish oil intake or omega-3 intake. So I'm willing to go, oh, actually, I'll spend a little bit more money per month on fish oil capsules, right? But someone else, like I do eat fish, salmon, maybe once, twice a week, right? So my background intake of fish oil is already relatively high compared to the baseline population, but I'm still willing to do that. But you may not be. You may be like Gary, someone that just goes, I just want to cover at least my bare minimum bases, So what are your thoughts on all that, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people are probably not going to be getting anywhere near like, 3 to 5 grams of combined EPA, DHA. Like that's a huge ask. I think if I get between 1 to 3 grams, I'm pretty happy. I have salmon a couple of times per week, and then when I remember, I supplement with my omega-3s. That's the problem. I always forget. But yeah, like that's I think it is a solid addition. I do think that if you get a high quality supplement, it's not too bad to take 3 capsules to get in that range of 1 to 3 grams per day. Bit of fish then a couple of times per week, and you're flying from there. I think that most people, when you look at the population evidence in Ireland even, and we are an island, we don't really get that much seafood in our diet. Like fish intakes for adults 18 to 64 come in around 25 grams per day. Take that across the week, you're looking at just 200 to 250 grams, or even less than that. God, 150 grams, which isn't necessarily a very big fish intake. So you might end up then per week with somewhere around maybe 1.5 to 2.5 grams of omega-3s across the week, which isn't a very large intake. Now, with that said, we do see benefits of eating even that quantity of fish. If you're having 1 or 2 servings a week, it still is absolutely of benefit to your health. But I think if you want to take advantage of some of the demonstrated benefits of omega-3 supplementation in clinical research, you do need to be shooting a little bit higher with your intake. And I think starting with somewhere between 1 to 3 grams of combined EPA DHA is probably a decent starting point for most people. And it can be economical. Like one of the ways I would do this is I'll wait until there's some sort of sale on the very large bottles of fish oils, like 180 or 100 or 360 capsules, and it would be buy one get one half price. And I'll just do that, and they'll be there for months and months and months and months. Just keep them in the fridge, and you're all good.
Yeah, and I just want to say on that, it is important to keep them in the fridge if you're going to be keeping them for months, because often people will go, oh, I'll just keep them in the cupboard or whatever. Like it is an oil, it will go rancid.
Yeah.
And also, especially if it's exposed to heat, like most of those fish oil capsules will just stick together. You spent whatever amount of money on this bucket of fish oil capsules, and now all of a sudden you've just got this fucking blob of fish oil capsules heated, melted together. Like you're not going to take that. Right? So if you are going to have a bucket of them, you're going to save some money, keep it in the fridge if possible, or at the very least in a cold, dark cupboard or whatever, right? But yeah, look, I personally think there is a relatively clear benefit to omega-3s, and supplementing with omega-3s is probably the most practical way to get enough in the diet, especially if we're trying to get to higher intakes. Let's say aim for 2 to 5 grams of EPA DHA per day. Start at that 2 grams per day. That could be as little as 4 capsules, right? You know, it depends on the dose. Obviously, like I'm saying, most of you go to the shop, most of them are about 400 milligrams, right? You have to take 4 capsules of that per day, right? Ideally, eat some fatty fish. Eat fatty fish 2-3 times per week. You can just reduce your amount of fish oil capsules that you need to take, right? There we go. That's my recommendation. Again, some people might say, look, it's actually not really worthwhile getting omega-3s. I just eat enough through fish in the diet. Unfortunately, most people don't. So you're going to have to supplement with omega-3s if you want the benefits. And also, even if you don't want the benefits, you still need to supplement with omega-3s if you're not willing to eat fish, because you still have essential fatty acid needs. So you're probably going to be in ill health, in deficiency, if you don't consume this. Like, you don't get to just opt out of this one segment, you know, like, because people often do that. They'll just go, oh, I don't need to focus on that. I don't care about the cardiovascular benefits, etc. Whatever. Like, you still have essential fatty acid needs, right? And there is, again, when we're saying earlier on about like pros and cons, you know, it's not like any of these are just like completely positive interventions, but that's also the case by not supplementing or not focusing on it in the diet. Like, by not focusing on it, that's not just automatically going to be positive. There are negative effects of having a deficiency of omega-3s. You just might not see it until you're 60 and having a cardiovascular event, right? So it's like, yeah, you might not feel anything right now, but that doesn't mean that it's not affecting you by not having enough omega-3s. You know? Anyway, Gary, yay or nay on the omega-3s?
I think that gets a mostly a yay from me.
100%, I would agree. Now, the next one, vitamin D3. Gary, do you get enough D?
I probably do get enough D. When I had my levels of vitamin D3 checked last time, or vitamin D checked last time, they were in a pretty good place, in a not even insufficient, in a very good kind of optimal range. Now, at the time, I think I was occasionally supplementing with vitamin D, but not very regularly. So for that reason, I don't supplement with it very regularly, because, you know, why would I? If you have demonstrated that you have a solid intake from your diet, then you don't need to be supplementing. Okay. Now, with that said, I think that if like getting a blood test, getting your levels checked is a reasonable starting point here, prior to supplementation. But with that said, it's also the case that many people in the population, here in Ireland is a great case example, are insufficient or deficient in vitamin D. And this does increase with age as well. And particularly given the role of vitamin D in bone health for the elderly populations, it probably is wise to, you know, make a more general recommendation here and say, yeah, vitamin D supplementation probably a good idea. For me, as I said, I don't necessarily take it that regularly, but if I got it rechecked and my levels had dropped, then I would supplement with it a bit more frequently then. You can get a decent amount in the diet. And I think if you are eating a mixed diet and you're getting, you know, dairy products and animal products in your diet as well, then you're probably going to be fine from a vitamin D perspective. But if you're in Ireland and it's also very dark and you're not getting out very much, you know, you might require supplementation. So again, it's one of those it depends answers, but I think I lean more in the direction of people taking vitamin D more regularly in this case, but with the caveat that if you can get a test to see where your levels are at, that's probably the best way of going about it.
Yeah, like best case scenario here, get a test, see where your levels are at, and then supplement accordingly with the advice of your doctor / dietitian, right? I know most people are not going to do that though.
Yeah.
So in that case, a more practical recommendation is, right, you get the sun in the summer, you know, in Ireland, maybe you get 2 weeks of the sun, right? But we'll say at least you're getting some extra intake from the sun. You know, you're getting more sun exposure from, let's say, March, right? we'll give it a little bit earlier, right? You kind of spring into summer, right? So from March to September, October, right? Just get into the sun when you can, right? Maybe take some vitamin D once a week, right? Again, just background. You're just like, oh yeah, maybe this week was very overcast. I'm in the office all day. I drive to and from work. I get in when it's dark and I come home and it's still dark, whatever, right? These things happen, right? You're like, I haven't seen the sun all week. Cool. Get some vitamin D into you, right? That's the sunnier months, right? Again, obviously, if you have a blood test that says you're deficient and you need more, take more. I'm not saying that this is always the case, right? During the sunnier months, okay, you can just have a very background, if and when occasional need, right? Take some. During the winter months, take more, right? You're like, okay, I'm not going to get any from the sun, so I'm just going to take a background dose of 1,000 to 2,000 IUs, right? Take that every day, every second day, every third day. It doesn't really matter as long as you're relatively consistent with it, right? Like best case scenario, again, you get a blood test, you know exactly where your levels are, and then you could supplement accordingly. Again, I know most people are not going to do that. So the easiest way to ensure that the vast majority of the population are sufficient in vitamin D, because I think it's like 40% of the population are insufficient to deficient, right? So that's almost half. Okay. So if you're like, okay, half the people listening to this are potentially insufficient, right? And let's say on the other side of things, 80% of the people listening to this could still probably do with higher levels, right? It makes sense to just say, all right, during the winter months or the autumn to winter months, consume 1,000 to 2,000 IUs per day. Vitamin D is incredibly cheap. Like you can get like a tub that'll last you 2 years and it's like £5, right? So again, really cheap, right? So it makes sense to take some. Now, there are potential populations where we would say, maybe don't take some, maybe it shouldn't be the case that you take some, but they are few and far between, right? They're much rarer than the 40% of the population that are potentially insufficient, right? So would you agree with that, Gary, that we just go at a baseline during the winter months or the autumn/winter months, take some vitamin D during the summer/spring months, if you remember, or it's been a particular cloudy or whatever week, take some. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. It is a fat soluble vitamin, so you can store it up and maintain it. You don't have to supplement with it every day in order for your levels to be adequate. So it is a case of if you have an identified insufficiency or deficiency, take it for a period of time and retest. If you think that you just like to cover your bases, then winter is probably the best time to supplement then. There's many different doses available. Like some supplements are like 5,000 to 10,000 IUs, which is fairly unnecessary. Like you don't need to be going that high, and definitely not doing that like regularly unless you have a clear deficiency that you're trying to correct. Like 400 to 800 IUs is, I think, typically what people will recommend as like a longer term intervention. But as you say, if you're just trying to cover your bases in the winter when there might be lower endogenous production, 1,000 to 2,000 IUs is probably reasonable. Like it's hard to give any sort of dose recommendation in the absence of knowing where someone's levels are at. So what you're trying to do is just cover your bases here. And I think taking a supplement every now and then in the winter is reasonable. And during the summer, then you probably don't require it as much. There are apps as well that you can use to check when you're able to get vitamin D, because that will vary by country, by even where you are in the country, the time of year, etc. And that'll give you an idea as to whether or not the sun at that point in time is adequate to give you endogenous vitamin D production.
I think that app is called D-Minder, as in like
I think that might be it.
I think that's the one anyway. I don't personally use it. But yeah, look, I think that's where we stand on that. Vitamin D, I'm probably, again, me and Gary have slightly different philosophies around this. I'm like, there's probably a benefit to staying on the relatively higher end of vitamin D levels rather than letting them get low at some stages throughout the year. Whereas Gary's a little bit more willing to go, look, I've had blood tests before that have said my vitamin D levels are in a good place without focusing too much on this. I'm going to have to, or I can effectively assume that that's going to continue to be the case, you know, so you can go, oh, I'm not going to focus on this, right? So if you're in the same position as Gary, you've had blood tests to go, yeah, look, I'm good. Again, just keep doing what you're doing. You don't need to change too much, right? Whereas if you want to potentially get extra benefit or optimize things, having a background dose of vitamin D probably makes sense. But again, ideally here, we would have blood tests, right? Like I know I've literally got blood tests before and I've been consuming like 2,000, even 5,000 IUs, and I'm still only in the middle of the range, you know? So it's like, okay, so for me, I know even when I'm consuming the highest doses that I could consume, I'm still not in like the upper echelons of the ranges here, right? So I know what works for me as a result of that. If you're coming to this, and again, you haven't got a blood test, you don't know anything about where your levels are at, a really practical, relatively risk-free way to go about this is I'm just going to supplement a low dose, and we'll say that just 1,000 IUs, you know, which, you know, if you look at the recommended daily allowances and you look at all the different stuff out there, you might go, oh, 1,000 IUs, that's way more than the recommended daily allowance or the minimum dose. But again, that's the dose to prevent deficiency, rank deficiency, right? We're talking about, oh, we're only really doing this during the colder winter, or sorry, I should say the darker winter months, you know? So you're effectively evening that out across the year. You know, if you're taking 1,000 IUs for 6 months, that's effectively like taking 500 IUs for 12 months, right? So again, we're just evening it out across the year. So that's where we fall on that. So again, yay or nay, vitamin D?
Yeah, I think vitamin D gets a yay. I just want to add one more caveat, and that's that vitamin D is also one of those nutrients slash supplements slash hormones that you'll see a lot of controversy about all the time. You know, you saw this throughout COVID, where people were identifying vitamin D as being a major risk factor for, you know, COVID mortality and all this sort of stuff. But and then people saying as a result of that, oh, we should get everyone to supplement vitamin D, and that would be, you know, better than the vaccine or better than other medications or whatever.
Look, wait, just before we go on to that, we can make a mechanistic hypothesis for this because vitamin D does seem to be immunomodulatory, right? So it, you know, modulates your immune system. It enhances, we'll put that in brackets, your immune system. So we go, oh, everyone needs to have higher levels. Mechanistically, makes sense.
Yeah, and vitamin D does without a doubt play an important role in the immune system. I'm absolutely not denying that. But the important thing is that sometimes nutrients can be decreased in a state of illness. So what you end up seeing is that if I get sick and I'm sick for a while, my vitamin D levels might now be lower. Then if you come and you study me in the hospital and you measure my vitamin D levels and I'm more sick than you, Paddy, you have higher vitamin D levels. I have lower vitamin D levels. You're not sick. I'm sick. You can conclude from that then, and you can come out of that and say, okay, Gary's way more sick than Paddy because he has low vitamin D levels. But in fact, what's happened is I got sick, that decreased my vitamin D levels. So it's actually the other way around. Now, that's not to say there's not any causal role of vitamin D in illness.
Even further to that, there's also this like healthy user bias type thing where like, oh, I get out, I'm really healthy. I go for jogs out in the sun, you know, I'm out there jogging by or jogging through nature. I'm getting some sun exposure, getting my vitamin D levels up. I'm really fit person, et cetera, versus the person that's in an office that doesn't get enough vitamin D, doesn't exercise, doesn't whatever. So it's not the vitamin D level that was potentially protective. It was the fact that one of these people is just healthier than the other. And as a byproduct of that, their vitamin D levels were higher because they're getting out into nature and doing whatever, you know?
Yeah, so the reason for raising that really is just to, I guess, be wary, not just with vitamin D, but with all of these nutrients and supplements, is that sometimes the reasons justified or the reasons used to justify supplementation can be a bit misinterpreted. And it can seem like supplements are like wonder drugs, when in fact, they're not really. And the thing you will see throughout this episode and throughout this series is that a lot of the time we're just trying to cover our bases and hope for a benefit. You know, these aren't powerful drugs. So anyway, with that said, let's move on to magnesium.
Magnesium is the next one, Gary. So I would probably be more on the side of people should take magnesium than on the side of, oh, it's fine, just get it from your diet. Ideally, our magnesium intake, we're probably going to get enough from eating green leafy vegetables. That's where we get it from the majority in our diet. You do get some from water. For example, if you live in like a harder water area, like I live in London, so the water is harder, probably has a higher magnesium content than a soft water area. Right? I think that's right. Can't really remember the exact proportions, but I think again, hard water, more magnesium, right? Either way, right? The vast majority of the magnesium you get from the diet is coming from green leafy vegetables. And unfortunately, most people don't eat enough vegetables, right? So we have a situation where, as a result of that, most people don't eat enough magnesium, right? And magnesium is involved in so many reactions because it's actually what ATP is bound to in the body, right? So ATP, is the energy currency of the cell. So everything that requires energy in the body, any enzymatic reaction that requires ATP probably also requires magnesium to be there, right? So we need to have magnesium in the diet if we want to have good energy levels from the start, right? But magnesium or higher magnesium intakes or levels, I should say, generally seem to improve sleep quality, generally seem to improve different muscular issues such as like restless leg syndrome, right? Cramping also seems to be a benefit from magnesium intake. Muscle soreness seems to be a very slight benefit to magnesium intake. Cramps, again, as I said, energy levels in general, and even exercise performance. It is an electrolyte, right? So there's huge benefits to magnesium. It does have a very mild decreasing effect on blood pressure, which again, cardiovascular disease, pretty regular killer of humans. So that's a nice benefit. So magnesium intake is probably a good idea to get enough magnesium. Now, again, ideal case scenario, you just eat green leafy vegetables. However, I know most people are not doing that. So it probably makes sense to include some magnesium in the diet. And what I would just do, or what I often recommend is, right, just get a magnesium powder, right? And when you have something like, I don't know, an evening drink, you're like, oh, I'm going to go to bed soon, have some magnesium then. You could also I'm going to put some magnesium in the drink I'm taking in the gym, for example, right? All I'm trying to do with the magnesium intake is put it with something else so that you regularly take it, right? Like Gary, you said, oh, you struggle to remember to even take your drugs, your supplements, whatever, right? Whereas if I was like, look, every time you make a coffee, you're just going to put a scoop of magnesium in there, like a gram of magnesium. It's just not an actual gram of magnesium, but I mean like a gram of the magnesium powder, right? You forget about it. You don't even think about it, but it's just something that you casually do. Like someone might put like a spoonful of sugar in their tea or their coffee. You're just going, okay, I'm just going to put some magnesium in there as well, right? Now, maybe you wouldn't put it with coffee or tea purely because there's potential that it would be bound to the tannins and the different things in there. But we're just trying to batch it with something else, right? You can take it in pill form. Some people prefer taking it in pill form. I think the powder is cheaper and relatively tasteless. Like you can get something like magnesium bisglycinate, and then you also get benefits from the glycine. So a very low dose, batch it with something else or put it with another habit, forget about it then. You don't have to think about it. I don't want to give a specific recommendation in terms of the exact dose because there's differing needs between differing populations. And I suppose it makes sense here to give this information. If you take more, you're probably just going to shit yourself, right? So that would generally be the titrating point. If you're like, oh, I want to try see if there's more benefit from higher intake, like basically get up to the point where you shit yourself and then dial back from there, right? And I'm saying you shit yourself. You're not going to just be like, oh, I just shit myself. But I mean, like you're going to have looser stools, potentially you won't be able to trust your farts, right? So that's the kind of level where you're like, okay, I probably am eating taking too much, dial it back from there, right? But I'm like, look, just take a smaller dose and forget about it, you know?
Yeah, and I think like most, I'd be pretty confident that most supplements that you'll take, most magnesium supplements, have reasonable enough dosing recommendations. Like normally when I look at them, I'm like, yeah, that's fair enough. So just take what it says in the bottle. It does vary a little bit, depending on the type of magnesium. Like magnesium oxide is far more likely to give you those diarrheal effects than some of the other types of magnesium. So it does depend a little bit on that. But in general, I think, yeah, I'm in agreement that I think magnesium, when you look at intakes in the population, and especially given that our audience are heavy exercisers, I do think there's reason enough there to suggest that magnesium is probably going to be of some benefit. Some of the effects on blood pressure, in some studies seem to be a little bit more pronounced. It'd be nice to actually have like solid controlled evidence on like stratified by different baseline magnesium levels. It doesn't seem like there's much evidence really on that. But yeah, overall, I think I'm pretty on the yay side for magnesium supplementation. But I'm also on the yay side for just eating far more fruits and vegetables than people do at the moment. So
yes, that would be the ideal case scenario here. Eat more fruits and vegetables. Happy days, you're done, right? Which brings us to the next one, Gary, a greens powder, and there's reds powders, there's different powders. But effectively what we're talking about here is some sort of nutrient powder. Like they've ground up some plant matter and made it into a powder. Yay or nay?
Greens powder is like, I think this is like everything we said about the multivitamin, but like lower on the hierarchy, in that like this is very much an insurance policy. If you want to have a greens powder, like I probably put the multivitamin ahead of that, just because the greens powders, I just don't trust a lot of them. I'm like this, if I'm taking 5 grams of this, I'm taking 5 grams of these ground greens, like what level of nutrient intake am I actually getting from it? It just doesn't seem like a lot. So for me, I would use a greens powder if I was traveling. I knew I wasn't going to be able to get much greens in my diet. Psychologically, I think there could be a benefit here in that, let's say if you have a protein shake in the morning, it doesn't feel like a meal. If you have a protein shake and it has greens in it, it's like, oh, that feels like a complete meal now. So I think sometimes if you're getting someone to just have like a shake as a given meal, like it could be a reasonable one to add in. If you don't eat fruits and vegetables like a child, then maybe it might be of benefit. In general, like, I'm not reaching for a greens powder or recommending it very often. My advice to clients is generally, look, if you want to cover all your bases and you want to get some of the potential additives in this greens powder that might be a benefit, go for it, but definitely not a general recommendation.
Yeah, like I'd be very similar in terms of my recommendations to clients, and even with myself, I'm like, there's potential benefit there. If you're having a meal and you're like, oh, there's no real way that I can add, or I don't want to add any fruits or vegetables to this. Like people struggle a lot oftentimes at like breakfast. They're just like, I don't want to have any fruits or vegetables with this meal. Handy enough to have a greens shake at that meal, fantastic, cool. You're traveling, you're like, oh, like I don't have ease of access to fruit and vegetables here. Cool, I have a greens powder, can be very handy. Using it instead of eating fruits and vegetables just across the day, across your diet, probably stupid. Right? There are potential benefits in terms of maybe there's only 2 or 3 fruits and vegetables that you really eat, that you're just like, this is all I eat. But I have this greens powder and it has 50 different fruits and vegetables in it. Okay, cool. Maybe there's some benefit there. But like you said, Gary, it's like a 5-gram dose. Like, how much are you actually getting out of it? Now, I know they're dried and dehydrated and whatever else, so it's slightly more potent, but still probably very low compared to just eating more fruits and vegetables, right? So first case, eat more fruits and vegetables. That's the best case scenario here. You can add a greens powder on top of that if you want, but it's not necessary. If you're not eating enough fruits and vegetables, well, eat enough fruits and vegetables. That's the that's our recommendation. But if you really struggle with that, and you can't do it, or you're traveling, or there's some reason, maybe this meal particularly, you're like, I wish I could get more fruits and vegetables at this specific meal. A greens powder, cool. I've no issue with that. I'm not like there's probably very, very little negative associated with that. Now, a lot of people sell specific greens powders and they sponsor a lot of podcasts. I'm not going to name names. But like it seems that every single person that recommends it just doesn't eat vegetables, doesn't eat fruits and vegetables across their day. So there's no actual magical benefit to it other than getting your fruit and vegetable intake up a little bit higher. Right? And they'll go on, oh, well, it has these ingredients and it has this specific thing or whatever. The doses are so fucking piss poor. Like it's actually reckless. But anyway, we'll move on. Greens powder, Gary, yay or nay?
I lean in the direction nay on this one, other than those conditions that we mentioned.
Fantastic. Fiber supplement, Gary, related to this. You're like, oh, look, fruits and vegetables, can't get enough. You know, I just can't fit enough in my diet. I don't like them. I won't eat them, etc. I've been taking a greens powder, but maybe your fiber intake isn't quite high enough. You know, you're like, oh, I'm not eating the fruits and veg, which is where the fiber comes from in the diet. I got some of the nutrients from a greens powder, but none of the fiber. Do I just add a fiber supplement? Do I just have a greens powder and a fiber supplement? Are we all good now?
Yeah, I think a fiber supplement is actually a reasonable enough recommendation, because there can actually be clear indications where, okay, this is actually likely to have genuine benefit for you. Like if someone has, high cholesterol, high LDL cholesterol, then there is actually evidence to show that taking a fiber supplement can actually reduce that. So in this case, I'm a bit more on the yay side of fiber supplementation. Something like psyllium husk can be very easy to add to protein shakes, or even add into your porridge and things like that. Obviously, it all comes back to the diet. I'd always tell people to start by trying to make some simple changes to their diet. For example, if you're having a bowl of porridge in the morning, could you get some bran fiber, wheat fiber that you just add in there, or wheat bran, I should say, or oat bran that you add in to try to bump up the fiber content of that meal. If you're having stir fries, could you add in some black beans or red kidney beans or chickpeas, etc.? All these little things that we can do to increase fiber intake, independent of like just fruits and vegetables. I always start there. But I do think that if someone is consistently below the level of fiber that we generally recommend, which would be somewhere between 10 to 15 grams per 1,000 calories consumed, then I think a fiber supplement is pretty reasonable. It's not that expensive, and it's not like you need massive doses. So I think it's reasonable enough.
Yeah, and there also does seem to be relatively a dose response curve with this, in terms of like, even if you're getting enough, let's say I'm eating 3,000 calories and I'm doing 15 grams per 1,000 calories. So I'm on 45 grams of fiber per day, like there seems to be still a benefit for adding in 5 extra grams from psyllium husk, like, is it the same magnitude of benefit if you were eating 5 grams full stop before, and then you added on top of that, you added in 5 grams of psyllium husk? No, the magnitude is not the same. Obviously, the person that has very low intakes is going to benefit from that way more, but there does still seem to be a benefit, even if you have relatively good fiber intakes, right? So I'd be in yay. I'd be like, yeah, fiber supplement, good to go. Take 5 grams of psyllium husk per day. You're probably only going to see benefits to your digestion, your ease of defecation, we'll say, and your blood lipids, right? I mean, you're probably only going to see benefit. Now, there are certain segments of the population where certain fibers or quantities of fiber, it's not going to be good for them. If you have IBS, for example, right, and it's just nondescript IBS, you're like, I don't really know what the cause is. Like, adding in some random fiber supplements, probably not going to be a good time for you. You're probably going to feel like crap, right? But at the same time, it could also be a benefit, right? And unfortunately, I have no way of knowing for you as an individual, right? This is why you talk to your doctor. But yeah, yay or nay fiber supplements?
Let's go yay.
I would lean yay. Again, diet first if we can. But even if you have a good diet, I still think there's potential benefit there. But again, that's my philosophy here with this stuff. I'm like, oh, there's potential benefit. Happy days, right? Next one, Gary, creatine.
Creatine. We won't go too deep on creatine because we actually are going to come back to it in a lot more detail in one of the subsequent episodes. But from a health perspective, creatine is probably something that is worth taking. Somewhere, 5 grams per day is reasonable enough. There have been some recent studies kind of trying to stratify this by body weight, which would be like, I think it's 0.1 gram per kilogram of body weight, which would be like 8 grams for me. But 5 grams per day is a reasonable enough starting point, or 3 to 5 grams, what a lot of people will say. Depends on your diet as well. Like, do you eat much red meat? Do you eat much animal products in general? Are you getting creatine in the diet? If you're on a purely vegan diet, probably not getting much creatine at all. So it's a bit more important to supplement. But we do see in general that there are, wide-ranging benefits beyond just the performance and muscle building effects people talk about. In particular, one of the things that seems to be of importance is for cognitive health. So if you're trying to stave off cognitive decline, you're trying to maintain the brain at a high level of function, maybe even protect against concussion and these types of things, seems like creatine is quite promising in all of these areas. So it's again a pretty cheap supplement. I do believe it's increased in price recently, since the pandemic. Someone asked me about that in my Q&A the other day, and I didn't actually get around to looking into it. They asked why the price has gone up so much. But like for me, I buy like the kilo bags, which I genuinely had for just so long. I haven't bought it since, I don't know, 2020, I'd say 2021. But so yeah, it might have gone up a little bit, but if you buy like big bags of creatine, it's so cost effective. If you remember to take 5 grams every single day and you buy a kilo bag, you're going to have that for 200 days. I don't remember to take it every single day, so I've had it for longer than 200 days, but it's pretty cost effective. Yay for creatine.
Yeah, 100%. This is why we put it in with the general health supplements. Like, it seems to have just good general all-round benefits for a variety of things. While we often just think of it in terms of its performance boosting effects and whatever, I would recommend my granny take creatine. It seems to be just beneficial for a variety of things. So I'm putting this as a firm yay. Take about 5 grams per day. Cool. Don't think about it. Just add it to whatever, right? The final one, Gary. I know you love these ones. Probiotics.
Probiotics, massive yay for everyone. No, probiotics, probably a lot of hype here. I think this area in general, gut health, the microbiome, etc., you should maintain a high level of skepticism here, because this is an area where you can make lots of faulty causal inferences. Because when you look at the microbiome, there's massive diversity in terms of the different, bacterial strains, also, other microorganisms, not just like bacteria. And we don't really know that much. In the grand scheme of things, we don't know that much about how these different bacteria confer health or detract from health, how they interact with each other, what might the benefit of having more of one, less of another really be. At this point in time, it seems like we have a general idea that having more of this is probably good. Having more of this is probably bad. And the problem is we often end up in a position where looking at these bacteria, we're saying, okay, this bacterial population it's reflective of the person's lifestyle up to now. So obviously you're going to see poor health outcomes in that individual, but is it just their lifestyle, or what contribution is actually coming from their current microbial state in their gut? So this is a really messy area. That's not to say there's not like valuable outcomes. There are some cases when it comes to taking probiotics that there actually are genuine uses, like traveler's diarrhea, I think is probably one of the best examples, that there can be specific probiotics that you take that might be a benefit here. But in general, I think it's hard to really say there's going to be any meaningful benefit here. I think there's some evidence in IBS, I believe, for certain probiotics, but this definitely isn't one that I'm leaning in the direction of yay on as a general rule. Many years ago, I used to think, oh yeah, sure, just take probiotics, enrich your gut, but we just don't have that much long-term evidence to really even be able to say what it means to enrich your gut. Like what does that actually mean? We don't really know.
Yeah, and like realistically, like you would have to take such high doses to actually see benefits. And again, then it becomes this, what are you actually trying to do? Like it's an argument of what are you actually trying to do? You're taking fucking trillions upon trillions of bacteria to hopefully influence your gut to slightly change its population. When in reality, we probably actually just want to change our diet and lifestyle habits to then influence our gut bacteria populations. Like what are you feeding this gut bacteria? Like why do you have this negative population to begin with? Now obviously, look, it's not just solely your lifestyle and diet and whatever, like again, early life exposures, you fucking whatever, right? But we probably want to eat a certain type of diet if we want to have a good healthy microbiome, and that good healthy diet is generally full of fruits and vegetables and relatively high in fiber. That's what we want to do, right? Which is just follow our general food health recommendations, and then you don't need to think about probiotics. Now, there are potential benefits, like you said, certain strains in certain populations or for certain conditions, 100%. And you can look into the research and go, well, I have this condition. Are there specific strains of probiotics that are potentially beneficial? And you might find certain strains, right? But this approach that people often have of, here's just a blanket probiotic. This has 5 billion, live units or whatever they're called, right? It's probably not all that effective. Is it all that harmful? Probably not, But even though I have this perspective of, oh, there's potential benefit there, in general with supplements, I'm like, oh, there's maybe a 0.5% benefit to this. I'm going to take it. With probiotics, I don't really see there being a huge benefit for the average person, Now, does that mean that I discount the research on like the different effects of like specific bacteria or different microbiome generalities? No, but I just don't think there's enough evidence to support the use of specific, general probiotics for influencing health in general. Or at least I don't believe that over just eating a good diet influencing your microbiome positively, So my recommendation here is just eat a good healthy diet with lots of fruits and vegetables, and your microbiome will probably be good. It'll probably reflect a good health or good healthy individual, That's my recommendation. So I suppose you would say that's a nay on the probiotics, but I'm also willing to change my mind on that if future research comes out, because again, I think there is potential benefit there, but we just don't know enough yet.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that I think it's a nay from a position of like open to changing my mind, but you have to just at this point say we just don't have that great evidence to demonstrate long-term effect here. And I think the other problem is that like, if it was like a totally inert case where if I take these probiotics, taking these bacterial strains, let's say, and I don't need them, I just like pee them out. Okay, fair enough. You're just wasting your money. But like, there's a non-zero risk of there being some potential harm as well. Like you are changing the life environment within your gut, and therefore impacting your overall physiology. And in the absence of clear long-term evidence of what that actually means, like I just wouldn't be leaning in that direction, especially when they're expensive as well. Like, as in, if you're going to go for a so-called high quality one where you're actually getting very high doses of strains that are generally supposed to be helpful, like they're pretty expensive. So I would for now say nay, but at the same time not discounting the really interesting area of research and probable future outcomes that I would be hopeful for. Like I do think in future that, you know, there will be better evidence for certain bacterial strains in certain people and better ways of characterizing who might be of benefit, because at the moment we don't really have great ways of knowing that. So, and nay, but not, but interested, I would say.
Yeah, I actually want to just add to my nay and say that in people that take antibiotics, maybe there's an increased yay, but I'm still willing to say that there's a nay for that, because, well, again, we might go, oh, you've taken antibiotics, you've been on like a dose of antibiotics for whatever, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is, right? And you're going, okay, well, that's killed off a lot of the potential beneficial bacteria in my gut. I'm going to take a probiotic and repopulate my gut with potentially beneficial bacteria. But the key word there is potentially beneficial bacteria. We don't know. So theoretically, hypothetically, I would be like, yeah, like there's probably benefit from taking a probiotic after you've taken an antibiotic, right? But do we have really conclusive research on that for you as an individual? No.
Yeah, and I think that's another area where there is actually controversy in the research, because some evidence suggests that, you know, that actually could be a good idea, you know, taking probiotics after antibiotic therapy. Other evidence suggests that you'd be better off not doing that. The problem is saying antibiotic is very vague. What antibiotic? What bacteria was it targeting? Was it gram negative? Was it gram positive? Like what? Anaerobic, aerobic, what specific antibiotic, what did it get rid of? And then are we going to be specific with probiotic and replacing that? So it's again, like I would agree with the caveat, but just appreciate that when we say antibiotic and probiotic, there's so much beneath those labels that we're not being as targeted as we think we are, because that sounds like a really like precise case. It's like, oh, antibiotic, I've killed my gut bacteria, build it back up. But what that looks like in practice is a lot more messy. So yeah.
Anyway, look, there are general supplements, right? So they're the general ones that we see people recommend regularly. We see potential benefit as we've gone through all of the different ones. We see potential benefit for the average person. And if you aren't doing these general ones, or you're like, oh, like my diet is generally good, you probably don't need to listen to the rest of the episodes. Right? And I mean that genuinely, because this is the baseline here. These are the ones that are like, these are the first line of defense. These are the things that you should shore up or think about first before you think about, oh, I'm going to buy these like really niche specific muscle building supplements, or these really niche specific like performance enhancing supplements, or cognitive enhancing supplements, or XYZ, right? Like if the organism, i.e. you, is not healthy, you're not looking after the foundational things, all the rest of the stuff probably doesn't matter, right? Like, yeah, you might get some benefit from having, I don't know, fucking 400 milligrams of caffeine before your workout, but it's kind of transient because your organism is not healthy, you know? It's like, it doesn't really matter. You're probably not going to get the results that you want because you don't eat properly, right? So anyway, this is the baseline. Again, you've seen our yay and nays, or you've heard our yay and nays. Obviously, again, lots of nuance, lots of caveats here, and that will continue throughout the series. But that's our starting point.
Check. And on that note, that's everything for this episode. If you would like more specific guidance on your training, nutrition, or otherwise, we do have coaching spaces available, so you can find information about that in the description box below. Very much relevant to this series that we're doing is obviously nutrition science, nutrition information, etc. And if you're interested in leveling up, we do have a nutrition certification that you can do, where you'll get a lot more detail on all things nutrition, enabling you to coach nutrition, enabling you to have a better grasp of how it is that you put the knowledge into practice. So if you're interested in that, you can find information about that below. We do also have an email newsletter where we send out exclusive content each week, so subscribe to that. Similar with our social media, we put out a lot of free content on social media. Make sure you're following us. And if you're enjoying the podcast and you're looking forward to the series, please do share it with a friend, leave a rating and review, share it on your Instagram story, etc. And thank you always for your support.
Enjoy.